All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews with Justin Clark, number 27. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for having me. My goodness. Thanks for having me, Cory. Yeah, one of these days, we'll maybe forget whatever the numbers are. I know that because I do digitization work in my day job, and you can see where newspapers mess up a number, like an edition number or an issue number, and then they never fix it.
Right.
So then it's just wrong for decades,
the rest of history,
for the rest of time. And so you just have to kind of go with the mistake.
Yep.
Because they went with the mistake. Yeah, it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. But yeah, so thanks for having me.
Yeah,
I'm excited. Yeah, sorry.
I was just gonna say that's kind of how I am with the interview series. I don't know exactly where I started counting or where I got the number from, but I don't think it's entirely accurate. But I'm just keeping going up.
Yeah, we'll just keep it going. Yeah, for sure. But thanks for having me. This is one that I'm very excited to do tonight, for a variety of reasons. I have wanted to do a podcast dedicated, or just a podcast episode in general, dedicated to Scientology for a very long time. Right. I was going to do one with Ben Burgess, and I think we'll probably still do that at some point, but we're just sort of figuring out the scheduling on that or whatever. So tonight's book is A Billion Years by Mike Rinder. And for those who don't know who Mike Rinder is probably the highest profile whistleblower of Scientology. He was in Scientology since he was a small child up until he was in his I think either his late 40s or early 50s. So he was in for a very, very long time. He wasn't just a member of the church, but he was also one of the highest level leaders within the church. He worked for what was called the Office of Special Affairs, which used to be called the Guardian's Office. Okay. So just as a preview for tonight, just to kind of get into this, there are going to be terms I'm going to use that you may have never heard before, because as all cults do, they use their own language to sort of inculcate people. So I feel free to read, for those who listen who are interested in learning more, reach out to some excellent resources. So Mike Rinder has a blog. You can read his blog. The Underground Bunker, which is run by Tony Ortega, who's an investigative journalist. His website's fantastic because he's been covering Scientology for over 25 years. Okay. And just kind of, watch some other media. So, if I would highly recommend watching the documentary Going Clear, which was an HBO documentary that came out a few years ago. And then, of course, the television series Leah Remini, Scientology in the Aftermath. Leah Remini, of course, the actress from King of Queens, who also left Scientology pretty publicly about 10 years ago and has spoken out consistently about their abuses. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of information that you might go, what is that? What does that mean? It's okay for the purposes of this discussion. I am sort of a Scientology watcher. I was never in the church. It's just something that has fascinated me for a very, very long time. Cory and I have talked about this before on podcasts. I think the way in which you sort of have followed QAnon is what I've done with Scientology.
Right.
And so, because I almost know nothing about QAnon. I know a little bit, but I don't know that much. Maybe when we do one of these sort of hangout streams, we can talk more about QAnon and I can learn a little bit more about it from you. But yeah, so Scientology, for those who don't know, so Scientology is and I'm going to put this in very big scare quotes, is a religion that it's a cult, but a religion that was founded in the 1950s by L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction author. He was a huckster of the highest echelons in terms of his ability to scam people. And in the 1950s, he wrote a book called Dianetics. Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. And what this book claimed was that the mind was divided really into two components. There was what he called the sort of the reactive mind, or the subconscious, the things that sort of held us back. And the sort of the reasonable mind. And the goal was to get rid of the sort of reactive components of your mind and reach what he called a state of clear. Somebody described Dianetics as like a pastiche of like Freudianism and American like folk psychology and hypnotism. And that's pretty much what it was. He ran Dianetics groups in the early 1950s. They were very successful. And then at some point they completely collapsed. He ran into financial problems. He even lost the rights to Dianetics for a time to another person. And in the vacuum of Dianetics going away, he created the Church of Scientology. There's a famous story. Anybody who knows anything about Scientology probably knows like the famous story of him saying something along the lines of, well, if you really want to get rich, you start a religion. So there's multiple accounts on whether or not he actually said that or said something like that. The two that are the most prominent are two fellow science fiction authors. One was Robert Heinlein, who wrote famous science fiction author, wrote Starship Troopers. And the other one is Isaac Asimov, the other famous science fiction author. Hubbard was a contemporary of these guys and wrote for the same publications, the sort of pulp magazines. He was a pulp writer.
Yeah.
Pulp magazines were very popular in the first half of the 20th century. And what they were these magazines that were printed on extremely cheap pulp paper. That's why they're called pulps.
Yeah.
And you got paid for the word. And so you wrote 11,000 words or whatever, how much you got paid, you could, and Hubbard was incredibly gifted at cranking out material.
Yeah.
There's some speculation that he might have had what was called the temporal lobe epilepsy. So for normal people, not for normal people, but for traditionally, epilepsy in most people sort of manifests itself as seizures and things like that. But with temporal lobe epilepsy, what it does is it has certain features of advanced grandiosity, feelings of religious fervor, and hypergraphia, which is just the obsession with writing.
Okay.
And the other science fiction author who likely had temporal lobe epilepsy was Philip K. Dick, who was extremely prolific in his own right and had his own, what he called his religious experiences. Hubbard sort of had his own. So needless to say, by the time that Mike Rinder is born in the early mid 1950s, he is from Australia.
Okay.
And his parents get him in. So he gets in as a very small child.
Oh, okay.
And his parents are sort of the impetus behind him becoming a part of Scientology. And at the time, Australia didn't look too kindly upon Scientology, and at one point even revoked some of its privileges as a religious organization.
Okay.
So Rinder is, he was very bright. He was very personable. He had a lot of good communication skills. Of course, these are things that he would use later as one of the spokespeople for the church.
Right.
And so he starts getting in as a small child. Eventually, by the time he's teenage, he's in his teens. He gets a full ride scholarship to Adelaide University, which is one of the more prestigious public universities in Australia. And he decides to turn down that scholarship in lieu, and instead goes into what's called the Sea Organization, or the Sea Org. And so at 17 years old, or 16, 17 years old, he signs what's the billion-year contract. That's where the title comes from. Is the billion-year contract. So people who join the Sea Organization or the Sea Org, and the Sea Org is essentially the ecclesiastical arm of the church. So the Sea Org is the sort of the bureaucracy of Scientology. They make Scientology run. And he joins it as a young man. And the billion-year contract is because Scientologists believe that you'll sort of live forever, that you're an immoral spiritual being, that a billion-year contract is sort of showing your commitment to the church. It's not like a legal document, but it's much more of like a commitment. It's like a promise or a commitment. And so he signs the billion-year contract. He joins the Sea Organization about 17, 18 years old, and then goes on to basically be on a clipper ship called the Apollo. Hubbard at the time, the reason why he created the Sea Organization was starting in the early to mid 1960s, multiple authorities from multiple countries were already following Hubbard's activities, particularly in relation to his taxes.
Yeah.
And so he had to basically go away and hide himself from legal and sort of political scrutiny. So he decided to go abroad on international waters. And so he buys this ship. It's called the Apollo, and they fix it up, and it becomes the basically the home base of Scientology for a decade or so. And he escapes the authorities that way. And the reason that the Sea Org is created is to essentially staff the ship. That's why it's called the Sea Organization. And there's a lot of paramilitary shit that happens in Scientology. So it looks like the Navy, like a lot of the stuff that they do looks like the Navy, because Hubbard was in the Navy in World War II. Right. He sort of claimed that he was like a war hero, but in reality, his World War II record was mediocre at best, unexceptional, mediocre at best. And so Hubbard buys the ship, creates this crew called the Sea Org, and Mike Rinder is one of the very first people of his generation within the church that joins the Sea Org.
Okay.
So that's where we can kind of start and then kind of open it up for, your reflection on what I've talked about or any questions.
I mean, I was just thinking like he kind of achieved like what libertarians have been trying to achieve for a while with the whole going off into international waters and like kind of just running your own little community.
Yeah, pretty much. And so, I mean, you're absolutely right. And so it is this kind of libertarian fever dream. And in many ways, like that was Hubbard's politics. He was sort of a reactionary right winger.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And he hated the government, hated authorities, hated taxes. Like it's all those things, right? Because when you're a con man, the only thing that really matters is money and power. Mm-hmm, and the two things that governments can take away from you are money and power.
Right. Yeah.
And so he kind of knew that instinctively.
Yeah.
So the early years that Rinder is in the Sea Org, he's on the ship in the Apollo, pretty grueling conditions. He kind of, he's cleaning the decks. He's doing this and that. He's just doing this kind of mess work, grunt work. Eventually he gets kind of clued in and starts working for another person within the organization. And eventually he joins what's called the Commodore's Messenger Org, or CMO. Commodore's Messenger Organization, or the CMO, is the organization where these people would basically relay messages between Hubbard and other people on the ship.
Oh, okay.
And this is also the CMO, the Commodore's Messenger Org, plays a very pivotal role in the history of Scientology, because another young person who was involved in the CMO is David Miscavige. And David Miscavige is the guy who runs Scientology.
Right. He's the head guy now, right?
He's the chairman of the board of Religious Technology Center, COBRTC, as they call it. Like I said, I've studied this enough that I know the lingo. It's sad, but I do.
Yeah, no, that's.
But anyway, so Rinder eventually sort of works his way up the echelon. And early on, he really has this like true believer mindset. Like he genuinely believes that Hubbard is, for all intents and purposes, a prophet. Because one of the things people ask about Scientology is like, do they think L. Ron Hubbard is God? No. Because weirdly enough, Scientology doesn't believe God exists. So, right.
Yeah, no, it doesn't fit into their whole thing.
They kind of believe that you are God. This is where it veers into sort of Mormon territory. That's why people call Mormonism like steampunk Scientology, because they are kind of similar in that regard. But one was created in the 19th century instead of the 20th century. But no, they see him much more as a prophet. They call him the source. That's what they call Hubbard in Scientology. And for those who've ever seen the excellent Paul Thomas Anderson film, The Master, The Master is an excellent movie. And in that movie is basically like a chronicling of the early years of Dianetics and Scientology.
Okay, interesting.
Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in that movie his name is Lancaster Dodd. He plays essentially L. Ron Hubbard. Okay. And in that movie, one of the books that he publishes is called The Source. So it's like, Paul Thomas Anderson knew what he was doing when he was making The Master.
Intentionally, put that in there.
Intentionally put that in there, yeah. So you have, because Scientology is this really strange belief system. I mean, it's no stranger than any other religion, but the big difference between religions and cults are religions have just been around longer. Mm-hmm. And generally with religions, for the most part, you have a right to exit. If you ever want to leave a religion, you can just kind of leave one.
Yeah,
mostly. But the ones that are cults are ones where there are actual social ramifications, or even ramifications to your own well-being, like physical or mental, if you leave.
Right. Yeah.
And Scientology is very much like that. And so he's on the ship for many, many years, proves his worth, and eventually sort of raises up through the ranks. And by the early 1980s, he's back on land. The Apollo is back on the shore. Hubbard goes into hiding. This is sometime in the mid-1970s. He goes into hiding, and stays in hiding until his death in January of 1986. And then people also ask a common question is, did Hubbard believe his own bullshit? Which I think is a good question. And the answer is yes. He really did. Because people wonder, with Hubbard, was he in it for the money, or did he genuinely believe it? And the answer is both.
Right.
He was in it for the money, but he also genuinely believed it. I mean, at the end of his life, he was having people do all kinds of weird experiments on him to get rid of BTs or body thetans. Because in Scientology, they believe that they have their own sort of creation story where essentially humans are immortal spiritual beings, that the body that we maintain is just nothing more than a body, and that when you die, they call it leaving the body, and you go on and you kind of live in another body, or you live in something else. It's very kind of reincarnation-esque in that regard. But they believe that you have these thetans, or these spiritual beings, and there's millions or trillions of them all in your body. And the goal of Scientology, and the goal of getting up the bridge to spiritual freedom, which they call it the bridge, but it's really more of a ladder.
Right.
And so it's like a mixed metaphor, but so the goal of Scientology is to not just clear your mind, but also to clear your body of these body thetans and shit. Have what they call cause over life, because they genuinely believe that by the time you get up to the full levels of Scientology, you're essentially an X-Men. You can start reading people's minds. You can start moving shit with your mind. You don't get sick. You don't have colds. You don't get cancer. You don't anything. Which the fact that people who have completed the highest levels of Scientology who have died of cancer, including people like the recent death of actress Kirstie Alley, goes to show you that Scientology is bullshit.
Right.
But Hubbard believed in all of it. He genuinely believed in it. He believed it until he died. So I'm going to kind of fast forward a bit and kind of talk about the power struggle that exists, because I think it's very instructive. I would say the way in which the David Miscavige became the head of the church is very similar to how Stalin became the head of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So Lenin was the prophet, right? He was the source.
Yeah.
And there was a internal power struggle within the Bolshevik system of who was going to take over after he died in 1924. Right. And there were multiple factions, right? So there's the Trotskyist faction. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in next time's episode when we do Trotsky.
Cool.
Because we're finally doing Trotsky for the people who are yeah. And of course, and then there's the Stalin. There's Stalin and the Stalinists. And the power struggle ensues, and ultimately Stalin wins. And the way he wins is by tying himself to Lenin in more ways than even history would prove to be the case. And that's exactly what Miscavige did. Miscavige was a part of the Commodore's Messenger organization. He was one of the only few people who was allowed near L. Ron Hubbard in his later years. But the only other two people who could have taken over the church, and in fact had L. Ron Hubbard planned for, because here's the thing, L. Ron Hubbard wrote policies about everything. Like he wrote policies about how you wash windows, but yet somehow didn't write a will. Like he didn't write any kind of real plan for who to take over Scientology when he died.
Yeah.
And part of that was, I think, by the end of his life, he was pretty mentally unstable. And two, I think that there was a part of him that kind of believed he would live forever. And so he didn't really think, but the only other people who were as close to him as some others were two people, Pat and Annie Broker. And Pat and Annie Broker were basically the only people who lived with him or were consistently near him towards the last years of his life.
Okay.
So L. Ron Hubbard dies of a stroke in January of 1986. And this is where the power struggle comes in. And Rinder is in the middle of all of this because he at this point had been a part of, what was the Guardian's office, what becomes the Office of Special Affairs. He's involved in high-level communications, legal consulting, all kinds of stuff within the church. To give you guys a sense of what the Office of Special Affairs is, and it's an organization that still exists today. In fact, I guarantee you, without a doubt, even though we might be considered smaller creators, I guarantee you there will probably be somebody from OSA watching this. And so if you are, hi.
Yeah. Welcome to our show.
Welcome to our show. And because it's essentially a mind prison, as Rinder calls it. Scientology is a mind prison. There's very little information that gets in and very little information that gets out. That's less so today than it was 10 or even 5 or even 10 years or even 5 years ago.
Yeah, like I thought I saw on Twitter somebody made a comment like more people know about the origins and all the secrets of Scientology outside of Scientology now than people do inside Scientology.
Yep. Most people and most members of Scientology, whether they're in the Sea Org or they're parishioners, what they call Scientology public, they don't know the story of OT3, the operating fate level 3. They don't know about Xenu, the intergalactic overlord. They don't know about any of that. And because if anybody knows anything about Scientology, it's usually from like South Park or something else online that people have watched about Xenu, the intergalactic overlord, and the whole dropping humans into volcanoes and all of this kind of crazy shit, which is essentially the Scientology origin myth, or it kind of is. At that point, Earth is a prison planet called TGAC, and it's insane. Like, it's absolutely nuts. And Scientologists believe that if you learn about this information before you're ready, that it will kill you. Like that's like the whole thing. And which is funny because Mark Headley, who was another high profile whistleblower of the church who escaped the international base and fled for his life in, I think, 2005. He talks about how when he left, he was so worried about learning about the things about the church because he learned about all this stuff online once he left. And when he woke up that morning, he said, I totally felt fine. I didn't even have a sniffle. That's when he knew it was bullshit. He was like, obviously this is bullshit. Yeah.
I'm supposed to be dead right now.
I'm supposed to be dead right now or severely ill or it'll give me cancer or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's a power struggle that sort of begins in the early in 1986 when Hubbard dies, and essentially Pat and Annie Broker are forced out. Anybody that supports them are forced out. This is where it kind of sounds like Stalin is taking over. Yep. And anybody who is insufficiently righteous is purged.
Of course.
And then
as
one does, and David Miscavige becomes the head of the church. I do want to back up for a second and tell people that one of the things that about Scientology that a lot of people don't know, or that is very interesting to me, at least, as somebody who loves studying politics and American history, the largest private infiltration of the federal government was done by Scientology in the United States. It was called Operation Snow White. And it was led by what was called the Guardian's Office, which today is called the Office of Special Affairs. They got a rebrand after this all broke out.
Right.
The FBI had investigated Scientology for years to figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
And what they were doing was they were basically infiltrating agencies within the federal government in the United States to purge those agencies of documents related to Scientology. So it was the FBI, it was the CIA, it was the NSA. They were all kind of enmeshed, the IRS, they were all enmeshed, trying to get rid of documents. This all starts to come to light. The FBI raids the Scientology headquarters, and multiple people end up going to prison, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife.
Oh, wow.
Mary Sue Hubbard, who basically took the rap as the leader of the leader of the plot.
Oh,
And
geez.
and L. Ron Hubbard was named in that lawsuit or in those cases as an unindicted co-conspirator. They knew that he was involved. Nothing got done without his approval.
Right.
But he kept his name off of everything. And they did that for years. So that if investigators ever came to try to find him, they're like, we don't know where he is. He doesn't run our church, you know?
Sure.
And the other thing too, is that if you ask Scientologists, like, who runs Scientology, and if you say, like, the Sea Org runs the Scientology, which is absolutely true, but the Sea Org doesn't exist on paper. So it's an organization that exists, but it's not it's only written in Scientology policy, but it's not a legal thing.
Right.
You know, so like the Scientology is made up of all of these different organizations. So you have like Celebrity Center, the Religious Technology Center, the Church of Spiritual Technology, like all of these different organizations that exist, Golden Era Productions, you know, and then all of the front groups like Citizens Commission for Human Rights, Narconon, all of these different organizations that exist. This is where I get very much like Charlie with the pegboard.
Yeah.
But all of these exist, and they're all Scientology organizations, right? And so on paper, the Sea Org doesn't exist.
Okay.
Because they keep it that way. They want it that way. Because if the public knew, because if the Sea Org was on paper legally, then people would realize that most people who work in the Sea Org make $50 a week. They literally do not make money. They are essentially slaves to the organization. So largest infiltration of federal government, they're invested. It creates a whole brouhaha. And by the time you get into the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Miscavige runs the church starts to change. And you'd think at this point, like, it can't get worse, but it does. And Rinder starts the beginnings of what would become his doubts about what he's doing. And at this point, he becomes the head. At some point in the 90s, he becomes the head of the Office of Special Affairs. He's essentially like the number 3 guy, with 3 or 4 within the whole organization of Scientology. It's like David Miscavige is at the top. The number 2 person is probably Marty Rathbun, who was another person who was really high up in the church. He left, became a whistleblower, and then he sort of came back to the church. But not really. So basically, he did a whole bunch of like whistleblowing and talking about the abuses of the organization, and then recounted them. And a lot of people think and suspect that they basically gave him hush money, because there was a very high profile lawsuit that was waged by his wife against the church for their abuse. Because Scientology has a pretty terrible policy of how to deal with critics. Now, they have it less so today because it's almost impossible to really continue to do what they do today. But it was a policy called fair game. Mm-hmm. And fair game is essentially the policy of as L. Ron Hubbard wrote it in policy letters, to destroy people utterly. Yeah. And to like make your disagreement with them public and be loud about it and make their life a living hell, which is what they did to Rinder. It's what they've done to other high profile members of the church. They do it less so now. Part of it is it's because it's not very good public relations, for one. Yeah. And 2, there's just too many people doing what we're doing, which is openly and publicly criticizing Scientology. There's just too many people doing it now. And so in the 1990s, there is a sequence of events that sort of push Rinder to the brink of wanting to leave the church. Okay. And the first one is the Lisa Mcpherson case. So the Lisa Mcpherson story is very, very important in the history of Scientology. To me, it's the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the end of Scientology being seen as legitimate, seen mainstream, and the beginning of its long and slow death. Because the thing is that Scientology will claim that it has millions of followers all over the world, that it's this like fastest growing religion. They make these claims, but that's not true at all. The real number of active Scientologists, meaning people who pay for services and go, or they're members of the Sea Org, that number globally is probably between 20 and 30,000. That's it.
Right.
And at its peak, it was probably about somewhere between 500,000 or 750,000. And that was in the 1970s. That was like the peak. Or 70s, early 80s was kind of the peak of Scientology.
Right.
And it's been on a death spiral ever since. And there are more people who have left Scientology than there are people who have ever been in it. And I think you said that earlier, but it's more, and so the Lisa Mcpherson case is one of those kind of pivotal moments where Scientology it never really recovers in terms of its public perception.
Right.
So Lisa Mcpherson was a member of the church, and she had in 1995 she had a mental health incident where she was at a traffic stop. She had a mental health She had a mental breakdown, and she took all of her clothes off and ran up and down Hollywood Boulevard, and she was in really bad straits. She's then picked up by Scientology people, or no, she goes to the hospital first. They take her to a hospital first, and then Scientology people come and get her out of there because Scientology is very anti-psychiatry. It's very anti-psychology. They literally have a museum in Hollywood called Psychiatry, a Museum of Death or something like that, an industry of death. Like they genuinely believe it. And a big part of that is because when Hubbard sent the manuscript of Dianetics to the American Psychological Association or the American Psychiatric Association, they full-blown rejected it, told him that he was a crackpot, and essentially told him to go fuck himself.
Right.
And ever since then, he had that sort of vendetta, and so does Scientology. And so she has this mental health breakdown, and she's taken to a hospital. The Scientology members, Sea Org officers, go and get her out of the hospital. They take her into the hotel, one of the Scientology-owned facilities, and basically house her in solitary confinement for 2 weeks.
Jeez.
And her condition worsens and worsens and worsens, and she dies.
Okay.
And it's pretty horrible. And so when she dies, because that's the thing, when you're a member of the church, you basically give up your rights. I mean, there's really no rights in Scientology, especially if you're not one of the higher up people who donate a lot of money to the church. And Rinder was one of the main officers who was within the Sea Org charged with dealing with the Lisa Mcpherson problem.
Oh, geez.
And so he was sort of fighting a war on multiple fronts. So there was the civil suit that Lisa Mcpherson's family waged against, that they filed against the church.
Right.
Basically a wrongful death suit. Then there's the criminal case against Scientology. And then there was another guy named Bob Minton. And Bob Minton was this, millionaire philanthropist who heard about the Lisa Mcpherson story, was very moved by it, and decided to basically use his own money to take down Scientology. And he created something called the Lisa Mcpherson Trust.
Oh, okay.
So Rinder is fighting these different things, and he's like trying to deal with it all. And he recognizes, I think at that point, he starts to kind of begin to question his life and sort of question his choices, that this is what my life has been led to. Because he makes Bob Minton's life a living hell. I mean, essentially they tie up his money within court cases and lawsuits. They try to destroy him completely to the point where Bob Minton basically gives up and settles with the church and just washes his hands of it, which is too bad. And so you have the Lisa Mcpherson case, which is very, very important to his Rinder's sort of reconsideration of what he's doing with his life. The other thing that sort of happens about a decade later. And so Scientology has very strict procedures to handle Sea organization members who are problems, those who don't go with the program, those who are defiant, those who are seen as socially deviant, or what they call out 2D or out second dynamics. It's a whole other thing. You can look it up.
Okay.
And they are put on what's called the RPF, or the Rehabilitation Project Force. Now, the way that Scientology tells it, it's like this like resort where Sea Org members get to sort of relax and deal with their stress and sort of rehabilitate themselves and get on the right path. When in reality, what it really is some kind of like Stalinist re-education.
Right. Yeah. It's re-education.
It's basically what happens is that you have to run everywhere. You're being given, horrible rations like rice and beans. And it's, you have to sleep on the floors. You have to do all kinds of horrible work, and it's grueling. It's exhausting. But that's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is that if for those who are the baddest of the bad, or seen as the baddest of the bad, but basically anybody who's higher up within the organization who has caught the ire of Miscavige. Because all this stuff is really set up. The RPF always existed. It existed from the days of Hubbard, right, and the Sea Org. But what didn't exist when Hubbard was around is called the Whole. And the Whole is this, at the time that Rinder was in it, because Rinder was in the Rehabilitation Project Force multiple times, and was treated horribly in those conditions. But he was also in what was called the Whole. And the Whole was basically two double-wide trailers put next to each other and connected. And it was on the property that Scientology owns out near Hemet, California.
Okay.
And it's basically out in the middle of nowhere. And it's called the International Base or Golden Era Production, or GOLD. They either call it the INT Base or GOLD. And the Whole was where Rinder was for, I don't know, I think maybe a year or two. I mean, it was like, and it's horrible. Like, you sleep on the floor, like you're given basically leftovers of the leftovers. You're made to do all this horrible work, including cleaning up this shit and piss filled lagoon on site with no protective gear whatsoever. And by 2007, because of problems internally within the church, that the person who had taken over for Rinder when Rinder was basically on timeout, who was in the RPF, was a guy named Tommy Davis. And Tommy Davis, whose mom is Ann Archer, the actor, who was also a Scientologist. Tommy Davis was essentially doing a very bad job of doing Mike Rinder's job. And so Miscavige essentially said, okay, well, he's doing such a poor job, we need to bring Mike back. And so Mike comes back into the fold and starts doing PR, public relations, and legal consulting, and all of that stuff for the church. This is where he ends up. This is why he ends up in London in 2007. Okay. And in 2007, Rinder escapes Scientology. It's what's called, it's known as, it's blowing is what they call it. Okay. So when you're in the Sea Org and you want to stay a member of Scientology, but you no longer want to be in the Sea Org, and you do it through the proper channels of Scientology, they call it routing out. That's the term. And you have to do all these things to basically be able to leave. Okay. But if you just leave without any kind of authorization and you don't route out, it's called blowing. Okay. And he blew in 2007. He basically took his passport, his money, and he took a train into London, got onto the London Underground, and disappeared. And turned off his cell phone because they knew they could track him that way. Right. And he left. He could not take it anymore. There was too much going wrong that he couldn't handle. That at first it was, Miscavige is a horrible leader. He's betraying what L. Ron Hubbard wanted. He's betraying the core ideals of Scientology. And then eventually, as he leaves the church, because for a number of years, once he leaves the Sea Org, he kind of still kind of stays a Scientologist, although not a practicing one. But then eventually he just kind of leaves it altogether. Mm-hmm. I don't really know how Mike Rinder identifies on a religious sense. I think I don't know if you would call him an atheist or an agnostic. I don't think that's him. But I think he's probably just non-religious or secular these days. He might be mildly spiritual, but I don't know. But he leaves the church in 2007. And for basically a period of like 2 years, he lays pretty low. He tries to rebuild his life. Because you have to think about it for a minute. The only thing he has on paper is a high school education. That's all he's got. Right, yeah. Doesn't have a college degree. Doesn't have a degree in anything. He's never had a real job. Never, So what happens is eventually he gets, the person who helps him sort of get his life back together first is a guy named Tom DeVocht. Tom DeVocht was also a high-level member of the church who, like Mike Rinder and Tom DeVocht and Jeff Hawkins and others who've left the church can all testify to the fact that David Miscavige was verbally and physically abusive to Sea Org members.
Right.
There's there are scenes within the book where, Miscavige is beating people up, or he's instructing some other people to beat people up for their supposed crimes and this and that and the other. And so Miscavige is known to be this kind of extremely verbally and physically abusive person. Allegedly, that's what the defectors say in the event that Scientology wants to come after me. But I don't really care. Fuck them. And also David Miscavige is a tiny, tiny man. Not just in terms of his ego and overwhelming his sense of empathy, but he's also extremely short.
Right.
Now, there's nothing wrong with being short. I want to say this right now. There are many wonderful people who are short. My wife is short. But I do enjoy making fun of the fact that he is short, much like the great YouTuber Aaron Smith-Levin, who was also a former member of the Sea Org who defected and is a whistleblower now too. They always make a point of saying that he's like the world's shortest cult leader and shit like that, because OSA members have to watch this stuff. So they have to hear their leader be called basically a tiny person. But anyway, so and I can understand how that can be deemed ableist, and I apologize for that. But I will say that it is funny to make fun of the fact that he's an extremely short man and extremely insecure about it, right, by all accounts. So Rinder leaves, and for a period of a couple of years, he's just kind of living. He's trying to build a life. He's like a used car salesman. He does other kinds of work. And then eventually he recognizes that he wants to start speaking out and speaking out on what he has experienced. And this all kind of coincides with some things that are all kind of happening at the same time. So the late 2000s into the early 2010s was also not a very good time for Scientology.
Right.
This is when Anonymous, the web hacker group, goes after Scientology very publicly. They do that in 2008. In 2008, 2009, the St. Petersburg Times, which I think is now the Tampa Bay Times, they run their series of articles exposing abuses of the church as alleged by former members. It's called The Truth Rundown. Rinder is one of the people quoted in that.
Okay.
And Rinder, who had made other people's lives a living hell by being basically, they used to call him Mr. Scary. That was what a journalist named Janet Reitman used to call him, because he could be very scary looking. But which is funny to think of now, because he's like, he's to me, he's like a teddy bear. He looks like Santa these days, but he's lovely, but he could be a real mean person, Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon was president, his chief of staff was a guy named H.R. Haldeman. Okay. Right. And Nixon used to call Haldeman his personal son of a bitch. And that's pretty much what Rinder was in Scientology. Right. He was, him and Marty Rathbun were basically Miscavige's personal son of a bitch. Yeah. Somebody who could do pretty terrible shit that the leader wanted. And he knew that. And so he starts to speak out very, very publicly about the abuses that he experienced, the abuses that he saw other people experiencing within the church, and speaking out about bad policies of the church. Like, for example, Scientology has a pretty bad policy called disconnection, which is essentially, if you leave the church and you become a critic of the church, you are declared what's called an SP, or a suppressive person. Right. And so which is essentially an enemy of the church. Anybody who speaks out, like you and I are SPs big time. Right. And
that's fine with me, but I mean,
that's
if
very
I
okay with me. I'm very okay with that. Yeah. And so, this policy essentially leads to people disconnecting from their families. Yeah, so if you're a member of the church and you speak out, you don't get to talk to your mom, you don't get to talk to your dad, you don't get to talk to your family, your extended family, you don't get to talk to your friends, you're probably going to lose your job. Like, there's all kinds of things that are going to happen. And this is what happened to Aaron Smith-Levin. This is what's happened to other people. And Rinder speaks out about this pretty publicly. And then you have the anonymous thing that happens, you have the Truth Rundown articles, and then eventually you have Lawrence Wright's articles in the New Yorker, where he speaks to filmmaker Paul Haggis about him publicly leaving the church because Scientology is extremely homophobic, contrary to what they will tell you. Basically, L. Ron Hubbard believed that being a homosexual was one of the worst things anybody could do, and that if you could just round them all up and put them on an island so we wouldn't have to deal with them, that was what he believed you should do. And so, yeah, like pretty gross stuff. And Paul Haggis has I think a daughter who's gay.
Okay.
And when he learned about the homophobia of the church, and he had been a member for many years, but again, the thing about cults that's very important, cults or authoritarian groups or anything like that, because cults don't just have to be religious. There are political cults.
Yeah.
There are business cults like multi-level marketing schemes, like Amway or like Herbalife is just as much a cult as Scientology is.
Yeah.
And what they do is it's the selective trickle of information. They only tell you just so much, and they don't tell you any more than that.
Yeah.
And groups do that. To a greater or lesser extent, my experience in some groups was like that. I'm not going to name one specifically, but there were some groups that I was involved in where they didn't always tell me things, and then I kind of had to learn them.
Right.
Or seek them out. But when you're in the bubble of it, you don't think about asking those questions because you kind of believe in it. You believe in the mission, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why people think, oh, how could anybody get into cults? It has to be stupid people. Like, no. People who end up in cults tend to be very well educated. Like most people end up in cults aren't like morons.
Right.
They're usually very smart people.
Yeah.
The person who thinks they can't get taken in by a cult is the person who's perfectly capable of being taken in by a cult.
As soon as you start to believe you're immune, that's where it can fit in, right? So
exactly. And so Rinder starts to speak out very publicly. He and along with many other people do that. Then there's the Debbie Cook email. And Debbie Cook was a high-level person within the Church of Scientology. She sends out this email essentially resigning from Scientology. She was like a CFO. She was like an accountant within Scientology.
Okay.
I don't know her official title, but she basically laid out what she believed were abuses of the organization. She then did a deposition where she laid out what was wrong with the church and accused David Miscavige of verbal and physical abuse of other people and improprieties with money and so on and so forth. Her testimony was so damning that Scientology busted their ass to essentially give her a big settlement so that she would shut up.
Wow.
And so that's exactly what they did. So they basically paid her millions of dollars to go away because because the information that she knew, she could not only back up with documentation, but could also be backed up by other testimonies of other former members, like Rinder, like Mark Headley, like Aaron Smith-Levin, Tom DeVock, Jeff Hawkins, Amy Scobie. The list goes on, right? And Rinder is somebody who, to me, and this is what I wrote in my article for The Truth Seeker, which is eventually going to be up on my blog if you want to read my full review of this book. And his story is really one of redemption because he for so many years did so many bad things to so many people, and has spent the better part of the last 15 plus years, almost 20 years now, righting the wrongs of what he did when he was within the Church of Scientology. And, and so much so that today, he, of course, has written his book. He's done tons of podcasts. He was an executive producer and co-host with Scientology in the aftermath, the Leah Remini show. Yeah. He does his own podcast with Leah Remini, although it's been on hiatus because their podcast was called Fair Game. Oh. And ironically enough, they were kind of fair gamed. So they have to worry about figuring out when the podcast will come back. But today, Rinder is not just a high-level whistleblower. He's also one of the co-founders and directors of what's called the Aftermath Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to getting people out of the Sea Org and starting over their lives. Okay. It's essentially a resource for people who want to get out of the Sea Org and don't know where to go because they don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have an education. A lot of them, because a lot of Sea Org members are second or third generation Scientologists. They've known nothing else but this life.
Right.
And so he is a member of he helps run the Aftermath Foundation and helps people leave the church. And, for those of you who may listen, who might be near, a Scientology org or within the vicinity of a Scientology building or anything like that, I highly encourage you to learn more about the Aftermath Foundations. They give out business cards for free that you can, if you're by a Scientology org, I highly encourage you to get some business cards from the Aftermath Foundation. They'll mail them to you for free, and then you can just start putting them places. And if you're a listener and you've ever received mail from Scientology, because the thing is, if you buy a Dianetics book or you take just the basic level communications course at Scientology, they will send you mail for the rest of your life, regardless of whether or not you've changed your address. What you can do, and this is some kind of like genius level shit, but what you can do is, if you get Scientology mail, what you can do is take one of those Aftermath business cards and put it in the prepaid postage envelope that they send you with materials.
Right, and return it.
And you can mail that back to Scientology.
Yeah.
Because the Sea Org members have to open that shit up, and then they'll have those little cards.
Yeah.
And they've already talked about how they've gotten people to leave that way.
Nice.
So Scientology is dying. I mean, it's been dying for a long time. It is going to continue to die. Its legal challenges are becoming more of a problem. The Danny Masterson scandal has made it even worse. Danny Masterson, who was an actor, who was on that 70s show, he has been accused. Yeah. He has been accused of doing inappropriate things with women. I'll leave it at that. And there was a trial involving that led to a mistrial. They're going to try to retry him in court.
Okay.
And there's also there's other suits. There's actually a suit where David Miscavige is named personally.
Oh, geez.
And so it's really not good. Scientology is in a really bad place. And a big part of that is because of the efforts of people who've left, like Mike Rinder, who've spoken out so publicly and so boldly and so courageously. Yeah. And what I say in my blog in my article is I say that, he left, he rejected the dogma of Scientology and he embraced freedom, which is the most precious thing that we can ever have, which is not just the freedom to move about and have our own lives, but the freedom of our own minds. He lived for so long in a mind prison. And that's what cults are. Cults or extreme religious movements or extreme political movements that are like authoritarian, that's what they are. They're prisons of the mind. They rob you of your individuality. They rob you of your sense of dignity. And we as people on the left, people who believe in the worth and the dignity of people, with the individual, and not individualism, not the stupid right-wing crap, but the genuine dignity of every living, breathing human being, that, we have to stand up and speak out against cults and other authoritarian movements that seek to undermine people's right to their life and right to their freedom. And Mike Rinder is one of those people. I'm deeply moved by what he's done. It's hero is a big word, but like he is somebody who I admire greatly in terms of what he's done in speaking out against the church. I think his book is incredible. Right. I read it over a week. It's very easy to read. And you can also get the audiobook. He reads it. And since he's got an Australian accent, it's kind of fun to listen to that way. Yeah. The other thing I'll do, and I was not paid to do this, but I will do a little plug. So I don't know how many more of these they have left, but I have a Mike Rinder bobblehead. Yeah. And these are little bobbleheads that you can buy from the Aftermath Foundation. It's called the SP Shop because we're special people. And it's called the SP Shop. You can buy one of those, and 100% of the proceeds goes to the Aftermath Foundation.
We have a comment. I'll bring it up on the screen.
Okay.
Nonsequently says, before I forget, I listened to the Leaving Leninism episode yesterday. Really great show, guys. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I had former DSA colleague of mine reach out to me recently and say the same thing. He really liked what we discussed in that episode. And yeah, thank you so much. So that's Billion Years. That's the book. I loved reading it. I thought it was a blast. And in terms of learning, I mean, some of it's pretty harrowing and awful, but like, it's really like, I have this, I'll quite frankly call it an obsession. I do have an obsession with Scientology. I just find it fascinating. This religion, it's this uniquely American religion because it's the thing about Scientology is that it's the only one where you genuinely, it's not the only one, but it's one of the only ones where you have to pay to play. Mm-hmm. You know, Lawrence Wright tells this story. Lawrence Wright's the journalist. He wrote Going Clear, which was the basis for the movie, documentary. He said, if you go into a Christian church and you ask them what their basic beliefs are, they will tell you.
Yeah.
And they might even give you a Bible, right? Excuse me. If you go into a mosque and you ask, what are the basic beliefs of Islam? They will probably tell you.
They'll give you something.
And they'll give you something. You know, they'll probably give you a free Quran or something. If you go into a Buddhist monastery and you ask them, like, what are the basic beliefs of Buddhism? They will tell you, and they might give you something, right? Yeah. Scientology doesn't do that. You know, you have to basically be like 20 years and like $250,000 in before you learn essentially most of Scientology.
Yeah.
And it costs a tremendous amount of money. Most of the people who are in it don't make a lot of money.
Yeah.
So they always make the joke about when you'd have the Scientology events in LA or other cities, you would see just parking lots full of shitty beat up cars because nobody had any money to buy new cars because all their money was going to Scientology. They were refinancing houses. They were taking out personal loans. Oh yeah, I agree. Scientology is so fascinating and terrifying all at once. Yeah. Absolutely. It is. It's fascinating in the sense that it's kind of, in my estimation, it's kind of uniquely American religion. I don't think Scientology could have been created in like another country. I think the sort of unique capitalist dynamics of the United States created the sort of hotbed by which Scientology could come out of. The United States has always been a country of hucksters.
Yeah.
We've always been a country of hucksters and hustlers and con artists and cads of all stripes, right? And demagogues. Like, that's America, dude. Like, that's P.T. Barnum. That's L. Ron Hubbard. That's Donald Trump, right? Like, you know, that's so unique to America in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's not in other places, but it's really something about America that we elevate bullshit to an art. And Scientology is one of those sort of artistic elevations of bullshit. And that's what I find interesting about it, is that it's just this, it has so many, like, because the whole thing about Scientology too is that, the thing with Scientology too is that, like, their whole thing is we make the able more able. Like, they don't give a shit about people who are broke. They don't give a shit about people who are disabled. Like, there are certainly not a lot of black people in Scientology. There aren't a lot of people of color in Scientology.
Right.
It's pretty white.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it made me think of a book that I can't remember the name of right now, but there was a book come out a little while ago.
Yay, America.
Yay, America.
Another comment was America has some really, America does a great job of developing some really bonkers cults, that's for sure. Without a doubt. I mean, and the thing is that, like, Scientology is one of them. I mean, there's Heaven's Gate, which if you want to learn more about, there's an excellent documentary on HBO Max about Heaven's Gate. There's the Moonies, the followers of Sun Myung Moon. There's Falun Gong. There's the Children of God, which was the cult that Joaquin and River Phoenix grew up in.
Right.
There's all kinds of shit. I mean, it's crazy shit. America has this unique propensity for bullshit, and I don't really know where it comes from, but I'm not saying it's like completely unique to us. But when you see some kind of when you see some forms of bullshit, you go, that could have only been done in America. There's no other place. There's no other place that could have come from.
It's the home of Mormonism, so.
Yes. And Mormonism, right? I mean, Mormonism is a sex cult. It's a sex cult. It was a guy it was founded by a con man. Like, you know, like Joseph Smith was just as much of a huckster and con artist and liar as L. Ron Hubbard was.
Yep.
and died in a bar fight. Like, and the whole thing was that he just wanted to bang a lot of women. Like that was his whole thing, right? It's and Mormonism has its own weird ass beliefs. I mean, I've never been a Mormon, don't know much about Mormonism, but like, if you guys want to learn more about Mormonism, I highly recommend Jimmy Snow on YouTube, who runs the channel called The Line. He's a former Mormon who knows so much.
Okay.
The best summary of Mormonism. Yeah, it's a sex cult founded by a con man. I mean, that's basically what it is, right? And they believe in crazy shit like God doesn't live in heaven. He lives on a planet called Kolob, that he actually had sex with Mary to create Jesus. They're like, when you die, you have something called celestial marriage, that when you die, you get your own planet. Yep. They also were essentially racist until they didn't allow black people in the Mormon church until 1978. Like, yeah, like it's just some crazy shit.
Yeah.
They do mass baptisms, especially of public figures. So like Anne Frank and Hitler have both been baptized by the Mormon church.
Yeah.
So like when I say like Scientology is some crazy shit, it's no more crazy than other things. I mean, Christianity's fucking crazy too. Like religions are kind of crazy. Like they just are. But the difference, like I said, is that Scientology has only been around for 50 years. Okay. Or 70 years actually.
Right.
But Christianity's been around for 2000. So, like the difference is that like Scientology was never interested. I don't think it was ever really interested in growing and being a mainstream thing. I don't think it was ever really interested in that. I think Hubbard was, but once Hubbard died, that sort of us versus them mentality, the sort of battening down the hatches and sort of circling the wagons, like that's what happened under Miscavige. So, and now really Scientology is really just a elaborate money laundering scheme at this point.
The book I was thinking of is called Bunk by Kevin Young. And it's the true story of hoaxes, hucksters, humbug, and so on. Plagiarists, phonies, post-facts, and fake news.
I have that book. I've never read it, but I have that book. Maybe that's a book we can do on the show. Because I think there's a certain level of bullshit. Like, I mean, I think it's like important for people to understand that, that just because we have sort of deeper political convictions doesn't mean that we can't smell bullshit. Like, I think, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's, it's really important to keep, it's that classic quote. It's, you keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
Exactly.
So that's a billion years. Check it out. I think it's worth reading. If you want to learn more about Scientology, just kind of look up resources. There are tons of them. But I will give people advice. If you see a website that's called Who Is So-and-so, don't look at that website. That one's set up by the Scientology. It's a hate website.
Yeah.
And the thing is that they're pretty brazen about it. Generally, if you see a website and they're like accusing somebody of being horrible, then you're like, I don't think they're horrible. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page. You'll see a copyright Church of Scientology.
Yeah.
Because
they got to take credit for what they do, right?
Yeah. Because even smart people can be kind of taken in by that because they don't know any better. But Scientology has all of these different hate websites. Good to know. Yeah. The Who Is Mike Rinder or Who Is Leah Remini. Those are all bullshit. Don't look at those websites. They're not real.
Yeah.
I think Mike Rinder's website's called MikeRindersBlog.com or something like that, but you can find it. So I finally have done an episode on Scientology. I've only scratched the surface. There's so much more we could talk about, but I feel like I don't want this to become the Scientology show. I want to just contain it in this one episode and then we can move on.
Yeah. Sounds good.
But yeah, it's fascinating stuff for sure.
Right on. So I guess we already know what we're doing next week, but I got to do it because it's the end of the show. What are we covering next week?
Next week we are covering The Permanent Revolution by Leon Trotsky.
Perfect.
We are finally going to get into discussing Trotskyism, theory of Trotskyism. Theory of permanent revolution is probably the most important contribution that Trotsky made in terms of Marxist philosophy. So we'll be doing that one in 2 weeks.
Sure. Right on. And where can people find your stuff?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. You can also follow me on Instagram at justinclarkph. PH is for public history. And my article on Mike Rinder will be in the latest issue of The Truth Seeker. Will also be on my blog probably within the next couple of weeks or so. And one of the other things I'm going to be I've been working on, looking forward to it. Thanks for streaming, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. And the next, God, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. And the other thing I'm working on right now is a talk that I'm going to be giving at Heartland Unitarian here in Carmel, near my house here in Indiana. It's the humanism of Star Trek.
Nice.
And we're going to be doing a Star Trek themed episode later in the year where we talk about Manu Sadia's book, because I'm also a huge Trekkie. So we're going to do all things Star Trek at some point too. So yeah, that's where people can find me. And make sure to become a patron. If you're not a patron of the Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, you should absolutely become one. Yeah.
And I'm I was going to say, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes for this one. That's for the 3rd annual Lefties Awards. And we're up against some heavy hitters for best streamer, but we're not on the best podcast or any of the other spots, but
We'll get there. We keep doing this.
Yeah.
It's an honor to be nominated. Yes. So yeah, definitely vote for us if you feel so inclined on that category. Thank you all so much for continuing to support this podcast and the great other programs that Cory's doing.
Right on. All right. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other project. If you want to contribute to all of that, then you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice would be great. If you want to find out more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all of my stuff, and check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can check out my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, the videos I do with my friend Damien Marie Athope, and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching. And make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Go join a local org or print off some posters and pamphlets and spread some propaganda.